The sound of my mother's crystal wine glass shattering against the marble floor was the best 30-second birthday gift I had received in 20 years. She stared at the thick card inside the sleek black box I had just handed her, and I watched as the color drained from her cheeks. Elizabeth's eyes locked onto the first line. Happy 32nd birthday to me. Here's the audit for 20 years of being forgotten. Beside her, my father, George, sat in a dead, suffocating silence. I stood there, wearing a calm smile, as the Napa elite watched the Reed Empire fracture into 1,000 pieces. The invisible daughter finally held the deed to their lives. Have you ever felt like a ghost at your own family's dinner table? Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I want to know who is part of our community today. My 32nd birthday started exactly like the others. Quiet, no texts, no calls. At 6 in the morning, the sun hit the Napa Hills, turning the vineyards into waves of gold, but the silence in my house was louder. I've lived in this valley my whole life. I know how to read the soil, how to predict the harvest, and how to manage millions in assets with surgical precision. But I could never predict a single shred of warmth from my own blood. My phone finally vibrated at 8:03. My father, George. For a split second, a small, foolish part of me thought, maybe this year is different. Maybe today he remembers. I answered with a simple hello. Kelsey, he said. No greeting, no happy birthday, just that sharp, urgent tone he uses with subordinates. Elizabeth is in a panic. The florist for Trevor's launch event is being difficult. They want $50,000 up front for the imported orchids Taylor insisted on for the entrance. I need you to handle the wire transfer immediately. I looked at the calendar on my desk. October 24th, my 32nd year on this earth. My father didn't see a daughter. He saw a high-limit credit card with a pulse. The launch is tonight, George? I asked, my voice as flat as a balance sheet. Of course it's tonight, he snapped, his irritation crackling through the line. Don't be difficult, Kelsey. Trevor's on the verge of a $100 million deal. This branding needs to be perfect. Your little agricultural hobby is doing fine, isn't it? Just consider it your contribution to the family legacy. My little hobby controls $300 million in prime assets. To them, I was just a spare tire in the trunk. I sat back in the silence of my office, the numbers on my screen proving what my family refused to see. I didn't just manage the land, I owned the future of it. For 20 years, I had been living in a prison without bars. That's the thing about toxic families. They don't need steel doors to keep you in place. They use the invisible chains of guilt and the desperate, starving hope that if you just do one more favor, if you just provide one more check, they'll finally see you. You become a survivor by learning to blend into the shadows of your own life. You say yes because you're trained to believe that your only value is your utility. But this time, my yes felt different. It wasn't a submission, it was a tactical deployment. I'll send the $10,000 now, I said smoothly. Good. Make sure it clears before noon, he grunted and hung up without a goodbye. I didn't feel the familiar sting of rejection in my chest. I felt the cold, hard clarity of a closing trade. I opened my banking portal and authorized the payment to the florist. $10,000 was a steep price for imported flowers, but it was an incredible bargain for what I was actually buying. Their absolute complacency. As long as the money kept flowing, they wouldn't look too closely at the spreadsheets. I was moving through the shadows. They wouldn't notice the blind trust I had established months ago. They wouldn't see me, slowly, methodically, buying up the predatory bridge loans they had leveraged against the Black Oak estate. They thought they were using me as an ATM. They had no idea I was actually becoming their landlord. I closed my laptop and watched the transaction confirmation glow on the screen. This wasn't a birthday gift. It was a down payment on their downfall. Family builds wealth together. That was my father's favorite phrase. It usually preceded a theft. When I turned 12, my father hosted a dinner for his real estate partners. He didn't buy me a cake or plan a celebration. He handed me a tray and told me to bust tables in my own home. At the end of the night, an investor slipped a crisp $100 bill into my apron and told me, "Happy birthday." Before the front door even clicked shut, my father held out his hand. He took that $100 right out of my apron. Family money stays together, he said, slipping my birthday tip into his own wallet. For 20 years, I watched them extract value from me like I was a natural resource. They didn't see a daughter, they saw an accessory to their social standing. In the Reed family, children were essentially property. Taylor was the high value asset, the golden child whose every vanity was funded and celebrated. I was the utility, the invisible infrastructure they assumed would always be there to catch them when they fell. This is the trap of normalizing cruelty. When a family operates this way for decades, they lose the ability to see the human being behind the service. They believed I was too sensible to ever demand an accounting, too desperate for their approval to ever set a boundary. They were wrong. While they were busy preparing for Trevor's big launch, I was performing a forensic audit on their lives. Trevor had just submitted a pitch for a $100 million logistics contract. I reviewed the documents Jenna had uncovered. It wasn't just a similar business model, it was a direct copy of my proprietary operational manuals and soil mapping data. He had stolen my life's work, slapped his own logo on the cover, and was promising a 40% discount that was logistically impossible without committing massive fraud. He wasn't building a company, he was building a bomb. I didn't scream. I didn't call them to argue. I called my wealth manager, David. Jenna had confirmed that George and Elizabeth had liquidated their entire futures to fund Trevor's scam. When that wasn't enough, they went to a predatory private firm for a hard money bridge loan, using the Black Oak estate as collateral. They were already 3 months behind on the payments. The lender was just waiting for the final grace period to expire before initiating a swift foreclosure. Contact them through the blind trust, I told David. Offer to purchase the distressed debt at face value for immediate cash. I want the note today. It took 48 hours of relentless negotiation. By the time the wire transfer cleared, I held the paper on the house I grew up in. I was officially my parents' landlord, and they were entirely unaware that they were now living on my mercy. They thought they were extracting one last favor from me with that $10,000 orchid bill. They had no idea I had just bought the ground they were walking on. This wasn't revenge, it was accounting. Taylor burst into my office at noon, without knocking, draped in an oversized designer trench coat that my parents had undoubtedly paid for. She didn't look at me. She looked at the dual monitors on my desk, as if my 10 years of grueling professional labor were just a boring screensaver. She dropped a heavy, leather-bound portfolio onto my neat workspace, narrowly missing my coffee. "Good afternoon, Taylor," I said, not moving an inch. "Appointments are usually handled through my assistant." She waved a manicured hand dismissively, her emerald green eyes glinting with a sharp, familiar malice. "We're family, Kelsey. I don't need an appointment to check in on my little sister's delivery hobby. Besides, I wanted you to see what a real legacy looks like. Trevor just secured the crown jewel for the launch toast tonight. It's a vintage so rare, the Heritage Cast Board is going to sign the contract before the first course is even served." She flipped the portfolio open to a series of high-resolution photos of the Black Oak North Vineyard. In the center of the images stood Trevor wearing a smug, tailored suit, holding a cluster of grapes like he had personally willed them into existence. He looked like a visionary. To anyone else, the vines looked lush and vibrant, but I am a senior agricultural asset manager. I don't look at the leaves, I look at the structural integrity of the ecosystem. I zoomed in on one of the photos while Taylor kept talking her voice, a steady stream of condescension about how I was bitter because no one was throwing a party for me. She had no idea the launch fell on my actual 32nd birthday. My eyes locked onto a specific discoloration near the base of the primary stalks. It was a subtle, chalky white residue, barely visible beneath the canopy. "Trevor found a miracle treatment," Taylor bragged, leaning over my desk. "The soil in the North Quad was struggling, but he brought it back to life in under 6 weeks. He's calling it the Silverleaf Protocol. It's going to revolutionize the valley." I sat back, my energetic pulse replaced by a clinical, icy focus. I recognized that residue. It wasn't a miracle, it was a death sentence. Trevor was attempting to hide the white wine plague, a catastrophic root fungus that could level an entire vineyard in a single season. But he wasn't just masking the disease. According to the chemical soil signatures in the report, Taylor had so arrogantly left open, he was using an industrial grade, prohibited fungicide to keep the vines looking green long enough to close the deal. That chemical doesn't just kill fungus, it stays in the grapes, it leaches into the juice. If they poured that wine for the Heritage Cask Board, they wouldn't just be serving a fake vintage, they would be serving a toxic liability that could trigger a federal investigation and health recalls worth tens of millions of dollars. It's impressive, Taylor, I said softly, my voice as steady as a heart rate monitor. Tonight is going to be unforgettable. I'll make sure of it. Finally, a little respect, she spat, snatching her portfolio back. Try to dress appropriately if you bother showing up. We have a specific high-level aesthetic to maintain. I watched her walk out, her loud footsteps disrupting my staff. I didn't warn her. I didn't tell her that her husband was poisoning the very soil they were using as collateral. I just pulled up my own encrypted files and started recording the data. Trevor had lit the fuse and Taylor was dancing around the bomb. I wasn't going to stop the explosion. I was just going to make sure I owned the rubble. I found Jenna in her high-rise office, a space that overlooked the valley with a predatory sort of grace. Jenna was more than my sister-in-law. She was a corporate litigator who specialized in dismantling frauds, and she was the only person who understood that my family was a sinking ship. She didn't offer me water or ask how I was feeling. She simply tapped a thick manila envelope on her desk. Inside was the financial autopsy of George and Elizabeth Reed. It was the paper trail of 20 years of misplaced loyalty. They liquidated everything, Jenna said, her voice sounding like a gavel hitting a wooden block. 2 months ago, your mother and father emptied their entire retirement portfolio. Every single cent of their $4,200,000 is gone. It would go directly to an offshore account controlled by Trevor's new shell company. I watched her highlighter move across the page with clinical indifference. It wasn't enough. Trevor had convinced them that he needed a massive capital injection to secure that $100 million contract. When the cash ran dry, they went to a private lender in San Francisco, a firm notorious for issuing hard money bridge loans to people who are too desperate to read the fine print. I leaned over the document, my eyes locking onto the collateral section. They had used the Black Oak estate. The vines my grandfather had planted the house where I had been treated like a ghost for 2 decades, and the very soil I had spent my life studying it was all on the line. They were 3 months behind on the interest-only payments. The lender was just waiting for the final legal grace period to expire, which was exactly 5 days from now. My father had literally mortgaged his existence for a son-in-law who was currently using toxic chemicals to hide a plague in the roots. They think you're the safety net, Kelsey, Jenna noted, her dark eyes meeting mine with a piercing intensity. They've been telling their entire social circle that you're prepared to step in, if there's a cash flow problem. They view your logistics success as a subscription they've already paid for, with the bare minimum of parenting. I felt the familiar click of logic in my mind. This wasn't a family crisis. It was a hostile takeover. My parents had treated me like a silent investor for 32 years, extracting my labor and my loyalty without ever issuing a single share of respect. Now, I was going to change the terms of the agreement. Buy the debt, I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the office like a scalpel. Move the capital through the blind trust I established. I want to purchase that distressed note at face value for immediate cash. I want a clean, immediate transfer of the deed of trust to my holding company. Jenna didn't ask if I was sure. She didn't warn me about the emotional weight of holding my parents' roof over my head. She simply picked up her phone and began the process of acquisition. I sat there, watching the fog roll over the distant vineyards. I didn't feel a shred of guilt. Guilt is a luxury for people who believe they still owe something. But I had performed the math. I had balanced the books. For 20 years, I had been the one paying in advance for love that never arrived. Now, the transaction was complete. I was no longer the daughter they ignored. I was the holder of their fate. I was their landlord. Jenna didn't wait for the morning to call. The notification on my phone arrived at 2:15 in the morning. I found the final nail. The message read, I didn't feel tired. I felt the electric hum of a system nearing its conclusion. I met her at her office before the sun even cleared the horizon. She was standing by the window, her silhouette sharp against the purple sky. On her desk lay a single sheet of paper, a high-resolution scan of a bank transfer receipt. "You knew Trevor was incompetent, Kelsey," she said, her voice dropping an octave, "but I don't think you knew he was a predator." She tapped the paper. It was a transfer for $1,500,000. It came from a secondary low-yield reserve account that my grandmother Eleanor had set up before she passed. That account was meant to be a final safety net for both Taylor and me. It was the only part of the estate that required a dual authorization signature from George and Elizabeth. "Look at the bottom," Jenna instructed. I leaned in. I saw my father's name written in ink, George Reed. To a casual bank teller, it looked legitimate, but I had spent years watching my father sign contracts. I knew the way he pressurized the pen. I knew the loop on his capital G. This was wrong. The pressure was inconsistent. The slant was off. "It's a forgery," I whispered. "Exactly," Jenna confirmed. "Trevor used a digital exploit to bypass the bank's callback protocol, then forged your father's signature to extract the last line of defense. He didn't just drain their retirement, he stole the inheritance your grandmother intended for you. And your parents? They are so blinded by his vision that they provided the cover he needed to rob them blind." I stood there, the silence of the office pressing against my ears. This is the weight of being a watcher. For years, I had stood at the edge of this family, a silent observer of their dysfunction. I was like a guardian, standing on a wall, watching a storm gather on the horizon. A part of me, that old, starving part of me, had kept hoping they would see the lightning and turn back. I had waited, vigilant and quiet, hoping George would look at a balance sheet instead of a suit, hoping Elizabeth would value a daughter's work over an intruder's buzzwords. But being a watcher also means carrying the regret of the inevitable. I realized that my silence wasn't just patience. It was the slow acknowledgement that they were determined to be victims of their own favoritism. They hadn't just ignored me, they had actively enabled the person who was destroying them. My grandmother had wanted that money to build a future. Trevor had used it to buy the illusion of one. "What do you want to do with the criminal warrants?" Jenna asked. "File them," I said, my voice carrying the absolute finality of a judge. "I want the district attorney's investigators briefed and ready for tonight. If my family wants to celebrate a thief, I'm going to make sure the world sees the asset freeze and subpoenas that come with the crown." The trap was no longer just financial. It was criminal. I walked out of the building as the first rays of light hit the valley. Tonight wasn't just about a brand launch. It was an execution. The gala at Black Oak was a masterclass in superficiality. I stood in the shadows of the service corridor, watching the $100 million deal Trevor had tried to steal teeter on the edge of his own arrogance. The $10,000 worth of cascading orchids I had paid for framed my father like a modern-day monarch, creating a fragrant, suffocating archway for the elite of Napa Valley. At exactly 8:15, the room went silent as George tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon. Trevor stood up, holding the crown jewel bottle with the reverence of a priest holding a sacred relic. To honor this partnership with Heritage Cask, he announced, his voice thick with unearned satisfaction, "We are pouring a vintage that holds the very history of this soil." He reached for a specialized corkscrew, ready to pour the toxic liability into the glasses of the Valley's most powerful executives. I didn't rush. I walked toward the head table with the measured, deliberate pace of a CEO entering a hostile boardroom. My mother's eyes widened in horror, a silent command for me to return to the kitchen and remain invisible, but I was already at the podium. I didn't ask for permission. I reached out and firmly placed my hand over the microphone my father was still holding. "That is a very impressive gesture, Trevor," I said, my voice echoing crisp and clear through the ballroom. "But in my industry, verifying the asset is the entire job. May I see the bottle?" I didn't wait for his consent. I took the heavy glass from his hands before he could react. I held it under the glare of the crystal chandeliers. The federal tax stamp on a legitimate vintage of this era features a very specific serialized blue hue. The stamp on this bottle is a bright modern teal. The gloss finish indicates a synthetic adhesive that wasn't even introduced until 2005. I turned to the Heritage Cask board. This isn't a rare vintage. It is colored water, mixed with industrial-grade chemicals, used to cover up the vine necrosis currently ravaging your North Quad. If you drink this, you aren't just sampling wine. You are ingesting a $50 million liability gap that Trevor tried to hide with my father's forged signature. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Harrison Cole recoiled in professional disgust, and the silver-haired board members exchanged looks of lethal precision. Trevor looked like a man struck by lightning, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. But I wasn't finished. Julian, the head waiter, emerged from the corridor carrying the sleek black gift box. He placed it exactly in front of my mother. Elizabeth, driven by decades of social conditioning, saw the silver ribbon as a lifeline and assumed an investor was stepping in to save their prestige. She pulled the silk apart and opened the card. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She read the first line aloud into the microphone. Happy 32nd birthday to me. Here is your 20-year ledger. The crystal wine glass in her left hand slipped and hit the marble floor. It was a sharp, explosive shatter. My father snatched the legal documents from the box. Notice of default and transfer of deed, he read, his voice dropping into a register of primal terror. I bought your distress debt through a blind trust. Yesterday afternoon, I stated, my voice projecting across the quiet room. You used this historic estate as collateral to fund a thief. Now, I own the collateral. I am your landlord, and the formal notice to quit is at the bottom of that box. George sat frozen in a silence that felt like eternity, while the Napa elite began to whisper in retreat, their phone cameras catching every second of the Reed family's public execution. I looked at my hyperventilating sister, Taylor, and her fraud of a husband. I didn't ruin your life, Taylor, I said softly, the words falling like blocks of ice. I just finally handed you the bill for it. The legal battle was swift, and 30 days later, the county sheriff arrived at the Black Oak estate. My father, the man who spent his entire life projecting an aura of untouchable wealth, stood on the manicured lawn he no longer owned and watched deputies remove his belongings. George and Elizabeth didn't move to a luxury high-rise or another elite community. They downsized to a modest two-bedroom condominium on the outskirts of the valley. They finally understood the painful reality of their situation. Their authority was just a shell, an illusion of power from an empty wallet. Once the capital vanished, the high society invitation stopped, and the prestige they prioritized over their own daughter evaporated. They are now experiencing the suffocating anxiety of living paycheck to paycheck, terrified of the next legal bill. The most poetic justice was reserved for my sister. Taylor had spent her entire adult life insulated by favoritism, viewing labor as something beneath her. She routinely mocked my logistics firm, calling me a delivery driver, while she spent our parents' shrinking bank accounts on a designer lifestyle. When the fraud investigation into Trevor triggered an absolute asset freeze, Taylor was left with nothing. No savings, no investments, and no marketable skills. 3 months after the final asset freeze, the designer lifestyle was a buried memory. Today, Taylor works the second shift line at a fulfillment warehouse, spending 8 hours a day packing boxes and loading pallets. The golden child, who told me to hide in the kitchen, is now a delivery worker for minimum wage. I didn't feel the urge to gloat. I was too focused on the justice of the seed sower, establishing the Eleanor Conservation Fund to save the vines, Trevor nearly destroyed with his toxic chemicals. I chose to build a future for the land rather than just burning down the past. I've come to realize that success is the loudest truth teller. It strips away the gaslighting and silences the people who are committed to misunderstanding you. If you find yourself in a similar situation, always being the ghost or the utility at your own family's table, remember this: your value is not determined by how much abuse you can tolerate in the name of loyalty. You do not owe anyone your future or your peace of mind just because you share genetic material. Setting a boundary is not an act of revenge. It is an act of profound self-preservation. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. You cannot heal in the exact environment that is actively making you sick. Take that relentless energy and pour it into your own foundation. Build your own empire, and one day, the people who overlooked you will realize the safety net is gone. When that day comes, you won't have to argue for respect. You will simply hand them the bill. I am Kelsey. I am no longer the invisible daughter. I am the CEO of my own life, and I finally hold the deed. If this story helped you feel understood, please hit the like button. Subscribe to Cherry Vengeance so we can break toxic cycles together. Protect your peace and always check the fine print on every contract. I will see you in the next story.